You see Pulsa okay? Greetings and welcome to the channel. Now, if you could, please leave a tip. My family is starving and I live in a garage. Pulsa is dying. What is going on with tipping? Everywhere you go, there's a rotating iPad pressuring you into tipping at places that never used to ask for tips, like smoke shops and bodegas. A friend pulled out a Square reader after giving me advice the other day. It's only a matter of time before you go to the ER for a strange abdominal pain, only to have the doctor ask for a gratuity on top of not believing you and billing you $10,000 for 2 Advil. And because it's become so prevalent, you end up in a staring contest with these poor service workers as they wait for your crumbs that the company refuses to pay them. I'm not against tipping by any means and still reluctantly tip every time I buy a coffee. What I have a problem with is how customers have been duped into footing the bill of worker pay and are now arbiters of good service who, more often than not, have never set foot in the back of a diner or a Chuck E. Cheese. To a customer who is already frustrated with increased prices pretty much everywhere, their resentment is often misplaced and their expectations heightened beyond what is realistic. Good service is no longer quantified by company standards, but by some entitled ass who thinks because they tip 20%, they basically own the place. It's an unfair burden placed on the wrong people when it should be directed at the owners of these companies. They don't even have to be billionaire CEOs. Anyone who doesn't pay their staff fairly shouldn't be running a business. I'm sure by now everyone has seen the memes that are a response to these new obnoxious systems that are objectively very funny. Some of the best, especially if you've worked a service job before. Starbucks replying saying this is anti-work is pretty rich coming from a union-busting corporation that definitely has the money to pay all their employees more than a livable wage. The conversation about tipping re-enters the cultural consciousness every couple of years or is just ongoing in the r/tipping subreddit where people constantly complain for and against it in the least constructive ways possible. But I mean, it's Reddit, what do you expect? Very pro-tip people argue that you have to tip 20% always, with people somewhere in the middle saying it should be based on the quality of service. Then there's the weirdly arrogant anti-tip crowd who say fuck tips altogether, make false equivalences about what it was like back in their day, and then brag about not tipping just because all somebody did was press some buttons on an iPad. As someone who relied on tips for many, many years, even I think there's a bit more nuance that's not being properly addressed, like how tips aren't always given out of the goodness of patrons' hearts or based on service or just out of pity. I worked at a Cold Stone Creamery as a teenager where we had to sing a song anytime someone tipped, like an ice cream themed jukebox. It was one of the most dehumanizing experiences, getting a cruel little asshole dropping a dime in the jar in order to force us to sing for their masochistic pleasure like a Candyland Joffrey Baratheon. Not because we provided exceptional service or gave them an ounce of extra ice cream. They were just dicks. As a kid, before I was afflicted with ice cream-induced PTSD, I never really understood why employees would need extra money on top of whatever their hourly wage was. I mean, I barely understood commerce when I was 12, and to be honest, I don't really understand it now. I knew why people had jobs and understood they did work in exchange for money that paid for the important things like skateboard and Pop-Tart. As naive children who have yet to experience the horrors of capitalism firsthand, we think places like McDonald's must be acting charitably toward their employees. Look how bright and welcoming the colors are. It's a place of wonder and magic and perverted hamburger thieves. Surely Ronald McDonald wasn't treating his employees like second-class citizens, and then we enter the workforce and see how the Happy Meal is really made. People seem to forget that not all work has to be backbreaking in order for it to be horrific, and a tip isn't just about how quickly you get your latte or how perfectly it was made, it's for all the terrible shit you don't see the workers doing back of house throughout the day. And don't forget how the lowly baristas have to deal with managers on a power trip whose entire personality is based on their job bossing teenagers around at Starbucks.
You fucking donkey!
My first job was around 2002, where I quickly realized how absolutely screwed service workers are. The California minimum wage in 2002 was $6.75 an hour, almost $2 whole more than the $5.15 federal minimum the same year. That was 22 years ago, and the federal minimum wage is now only $7.25. That's a measly 1.57% annual increase. You know what the rate of inflation is? Roughly 2.5%. But sometimes it's more. It was 8.4 in 2002 due to COVID and reached 3.8 in 2008 for some reason. Not sure. Inflation isn't even the best metric to calculate what an accurate cost of living is because rent, healthcare, transportation, and everything else increase at different rates. Since 2000, rent has increased 125% or 3.4% annually, going from about $800 to over $1,800. Math only Terrence Howard could make add up.
Unbalanced equation. What we need to do is, the first thing in math is you're supposed to have a balanced equation. 1 times 1 equaling 1 is an unbalanced equation. But the identity element, which is like the Jim Crow laws of the 60s.
So how anyone making $7.25 an hour in 2024 is supposed to live, let alone stay alive, is Sisyphean. To be fair, only 15 states abide by this minimum. The rest all pay much more than that by a couple of dollars or over 2 times, like Washington, California, and New York, with some cities and counties having their own set minimum, like San Francisco County paying workers $2.67 more than the state minimum of $16. However, many of those 15 states also have different designations for worker pay. Alabama can designate you a tipped employee and pay you as little as $2.13 an hour if they deem your profession makes a substantial portion of your wages through tips. It's fucking slave labor, dude. In the time since I entered the workforce, I've become more discerning about when and where, and maybe most importantly, why I tip, because I've come to understand what the true function of tipping is. There's a lot of historical context that's led to this 2-tiered system that stretches way back before the 21st century and made me want to punch a fucking hole through several of my walls after researching. Simply saying you should or shouldn't tip treats all service workers as a monolith and every job as being equal. Every industry is different and every company within those industries acts differently, and by differently, I mean worse. At the same time, I get not tipping the bodega guy for an Arizona iced tea and pre-packaged chicken burrito you went and picked up with your own 2 hands just because there's an option on a checkout screen guilt-tripping you into doing it. If we were to use that logic, we'd tip the cashier at Safeway and the FedEx driver, or the oil rig worker who sucks up all that sweet black goo used to power your Ford toddler plow. The power of propaganda has deceived us into thinking tips are normal and necessary, but no one questions why there's a necessity at all. I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting that younger service workers have to pay their dues like I did as a teenager 20 years ago by relying on tips just to scrape by and to build character or something. If the system can't be fixed, it should be dismantled and rebuilt, but continuing to tip out of sympathy just perpetuates this broken system. Technically, it's working exactly as intended, it's just a bad system. Companies and corporations won't change out of altruism, and when push comes to shove, the customers will withhold certain things, either because it's too expensive or as an act of protest when corporations price gouge their customers and then blame it on inflation. Inflation they created. When that happens, people are less inclined to leave a gratuity because you took all their money by jacking up the price of baby formula and started putting less cereal in the box, all while charging the same amount.
No, literally, just pay people a living wage and leave us alone already.
Tipping when you have to do the work is awful.
Yeah, what, come a year? We're tipping 45%, we're making the shit ourselves? The business must pay their employees. They continue to levy more and more on the consumer.
You're doing a peaceful protest.
Yes. You tip where you have service. At a restaurant, tip 45.
Now everyone expects 20%.
If you're feeling a tip, give a tip. But a mandatory tip, now we've lost the essence of the tip. Now we're doing wages. Now I work there, and I'm paying to work there. By the way, people said, oh, well, inflation, because inflation went up. Yeah, well, a tip's a percentage. So you're getting a percentage of the inflated price. What are we double dipping? Pay your people and leave us alone already.
It could also be seen as an act of solidarity with service employees who are getting fleeced on every paycheck. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. It is admittedly unfortunate that the first people to be affected are those at the bottom working the thankless jobs. However, again, I think most service workers know they're getting screwed just like the customer, only in different ways. It's not like service workers are just service workers and then glide into a fucking charging station for 16 hours like a Roomba when they clock out. They're also customers who buy coffee and food from diners. I think most service workers understand why people would stop tipping in good faith, which is an important distinction. Tips have always been used as an excuse for companies to not compensate their workers properly. On the flip side, I do recognize that there are some tipped workers, particularly delivery drivers, who do feel entitled to tips regardless of service and might just lie about getting a flat tire and eat your food because they feel like you didn't tip enough and then brag about it on the internet. Even when I was working for tips, I kinda hated not just relying on them to, survive, but because it was also a way for customers to essentially tell you your service was shit without actually saying so. The big issue I have is with the idea that a tip should be based on quality of service. Why must a service worker only be rewarded for essentially doing more than what their job responsibilities entail? That sounds a lot like wage theft to me. If you were an accountant balancing all the financial stuff for a company and were told if you did arithmetic good enough, a random stranger would come to your desk and leave you a couple of crumpled up ones, that would be weird, right? And if you did exactly what you were hired to do without issue, wouldn't you feel like you were actually doing a bad job when the pocket change man never showed up? It's just such a weird system to designate for this job, but not that job. Mainly because someone unfamiliar with the inner workings and standards that are set by the employer is judging whether you're doing it well enough. Who's probably never read the employee handbook and doesn't know what an accountant even does. You could be employee of the month at an Outback Steakhouse based on internal company metrics, and some dipshit could walk in, buy a bloomin' onion, and not tip because they thought it wasn't crispy enough or bloomin' enough, or that you didn't live up to some imaginary expectation. Like, who the fuck are you to determine what is and isn't good service? Are you Mr. Outback? Customer expectations are extremely subjective, where some are more entitled than others and get off on the power dynamic because they're sadists, and others who don't even ask for help because they don't want to be a nuisance and don't need their server to be bubbly covered in flair and just want to eat their meal in peace. So to quantify a worker's service based on the subjective expectations of customers by assigning an additional monetary value is just not equitable. It's a bribe. It's just a bribe. Which brings up the issue of how tipping is just straight up classist, where certain industries are viewed as more deserving of tips than others based on perception. I could just play the entire Reservoir Dogs tipping monologue here, but to summarize, we typically feel like a server at, say, the French Laundry is more deserving than the fry cook at McDonald's. Why? Because there's a drive-through? Because of the optics of fast food versus a Michelin star restaurant? I would say tipping the fast food server is more deserving of a tip based on the perception of fast food being a low-caliber job when it's just as demanding as any other restaurant. I've also heard people argue that working in a high-end restaurant typically results in higher tips and that you should just get a job there instead of at Denny's. Idiot. But let's not talk about how few establishments like that exist, or how competitive they are, or the ridiculous standards they set, or how they're oftentimes just straight up discriminatory and overall lacking in accountability. The show The Bear might as well be a documentary. 55 burgers, 55 fries! Not to mention Uncle Sam's grubby little dick beaters clamoring for probably a quarter or more of your earnings come April. Tips aren't just free money. Unless you're getting paid under the table and don't realize your boss is using tips to justify exploiting you. Just because there are some people who can make a bunch of money in tips is the exception, not the rule. And you might say, well, Starbucks baristas have access to company healthcare and a 401k and stock options, and bartenders and tattooers and barbers don't get those perks, so they need all the extra cash they can get. To which I would say, they should get those same benefits. Just because some companies don't offer those perks doesn't mean that too should be accepted without its own criticism. If customers are willing to pay for goods and services, then the person providing those goods and services should live in safety, comfort, and dignity, or the job shouldn't exist. It's the company's responsibility to ensure those standards, and everyone is arguing about the wrong thing. You're not really mad about tips. You're mad that CEOs are making 200 times more than their workers who absolutely do not provide 200 times the value. It's also weird to hear workers defending tip culture and under-the-table work because they want to walk home with a fat stack of cash. It's short-sighted and selfish, which ultimately creates more of a burden on you, the worker. It allows companies to justify not paying more than $2.13 an hour because you might make up that difference in tips. As for customers who are against tipping altogether, the argument is usually, well, prices will go up. You mean more than they already go up due to inflation and corporate greed and price gouging? If things are too expensive, people typically stop paying for them. I'm not talking about stuff like, insulin that you have to buy and then unfortunately ration, otherwise you die because capitalism loves to profit off of the suffering of others. I'm talking about a $12 Frappuccino. If something costs too much and is not a necessity, a company can price out their customer due to hubris and then lose revenue, a phenomenon we're literally seeing the effects of right now. Companies have been slashing prices by almost 50% lately on most goods, which means they could have been charging us those prices this whole time. If you think your moons over my hammy is going to skyrocket, you're just wrong. Using the informal Big Mac index that measures the purchasing power parity between two currencies and market exchange rates of the cost of goods in different countries, there are several places that have a higher minimum wage where the cost of a Big Mac is equal to or less than the cost in the US. For countries where a Big Mac is more than the US, the average McDonald's salary is also more, by like a lot. What that means is when prices go up because companies pay their employees more, they have more money. More money means they can buy more stuff despite a small increase in the cost of those goods and services. A lot of those places are also able to afford both maternity and paternity leave, guaranteed vacation time, and several other benefits that the US claims are too expensive despite being the wealthiest nation on the planet. You know where we spend all that money. The only reason companies don't pay their employees is so they can cosplay as Smaug and hoard all that burger wealth. So dumb. When you do that, money isn't circulating in the economy, the one thing it's supposed to do. What about bartenders and waitstaff? Surely they'd be living in poverty if they were paid a minimum wage instead of a tipped wage. Quite the opposite. The poverty rate in states that pay their waitstaff a minimum wage rather than a tipped one actually resulted in a lower poverty rate of 7% instead of 18%. People are often afraid to voice their opinions on tipping because there's a social pressure to just do it and a fear of inconveniencing other customers. Most people don't want to be seen as rude or out of touch even when the tip screen calculates tip percentages wrong and doesn't even let you select a different amount. We've also gotten used to pandemic tipping where, if you remember, there was a huge push by companies reminding us to treat their Grubhub drivers with respect because they were risking their lives delivering your pho you couldn't live without. We haven't really moved on from that mentality, which to an extent is a good thing. Treating people with basic dignity is something we should all be practicing more of. But it quickly started to feel like labor washing, where these companies would say how essential their employees were and how they're family, only to then lobby against propositions that would make them full-time employees entitled to company benefits. Now we're all wise to the marketing tactic and pissed that we got tricked. It's bled over into other industries where in a 2023 survey, Pew Research found that 72% of 12,000 participants said they're being asked to tip more frequently than they were in the past. We're all bearing the brunt of companies not doing the bare minimum. It's not the job of the individual customer to subsidize the paycheck of workers. When tipping becomes perfunctory and mandated, it's no longer charitable. The whole point of what tips are, I thought. Well, if they can't afford to tip, they shouldn't eat out. That's the same argument as saying, you seem to hate society and yet you participate. Curious. First of all, some people live in food deserts and are forced to eat out because it's sometimes the only option, and they've got kids and are working multiple jobs and literally don't have time to make a home-cooked meal. I swear to God, people forget there are millions of other people working multiple jobs and are still barely scraping by. Besides, buying a coffee now and again just to feel some kind of joy is the lowest bar imaginable. If treating yourself to some boba occasionally in order to feel alive is the only thing you've got going for you, something is fundamentally broken. Secondly, none of us chose this system of commerce. We were born into it against our will. If anything, that gives us more of a right to criticize the system precisely because we know how it doesn't work for the majority of people. Most of us can't just opt out of an inequitable system. We're broke and forced to participate against our will. Just like service workers aren't a monolith, neither are customers. It's okay to want a better system rather than accept complacency and throw your hands up and go, well, it is what it is. You effectively just said nothing and wasted everyone's time, and we all hate you now. If a place is asking for tips, that's usually a sign that the workers are, probably being exploited. I don't know how many times I have to say this. And that's not just my opinion. Going back to the origins of tipping to really hammer this home, as with most things in the US, tipping has roots in racism. and slavery. America! You see, tipping is linked to the racial oppression of the post-Civil War Reconstruction period, where wealthy Americans in the 1850s rediscovered the tradition, which actually originates even further back to the medieval era as a master serf custom. Cool! Surprisingly, even back then, people thought it was both condescending and classist, and recognized the plight of poor Americans who could barely afford to buy food. Asking for a tip on top of that was seen as offensive. In the 1800s, it was pretty cut and dry 200 years ago, and yet people today really struggle with the idea despite how much more civilized we are. After the Constitution was amended in the wake of the Civil War, many who did not end up sharecropping worked menial jobs where employers would not actually pay them anything under the condition that guests would offer a tip if they did a good enough job. Basically, it was just a continuation of slavery, and the practice was actually abolished for a few years by 6 states in 1915. In fact, Georgia deemed tips as being commercial bribes in 1918, which is hilarious considering they're one of those states that has a tipped minimum of $2.13 today. Unfortunately, all these laws were repealed for being unconstitutional in 1926 when business owners realized they could benefit from subsidizing worker pay with guest tips. There was then further legislation in 1938 and 1970 that solidified companies' ability to exploit workers for all time, or at least until they worked themselves to death. Tipping is outdated and socially confusing. While I'm not saying never tip again, you should do it because you feel compelled to out of charity, not because it's an expected tradition. It shouldn't be mandatory because some greedy fuck during the Civil War didn't want to pay his workers. At this point, tips just feel like a drop in the bucket for the majority of workers and puts them in the unfair position of having to do more than what is required of them and nothing to improve the system. So, with that in mind, do we really want to continue to take part in a custom that is inherently classist and racist? I should think not. So what's the solution, right? Talking about and critiquing tip culture is a good start, but we need new policy that sets higher federal and state minimum wages, guarantees worker protections, and abolishes tips. Again. And we gotta start calling them bribes too, guys. That's what a bribe is. I give you money to do something extra that you're not supposed to or required to do. Bribes! That's the video. Thanks so much for sticking around. If you made it this far, that means you're special. Leave a comment for Pole Saw. Say how much you like them. I made sure that they were a little bit more in frame because apparently they're my mascot. I don't understand why, how this happened. I got a Pole Saw as a mascot. I actually have been working on Pole Saw like designs for merch potentially. But I'm not a graphic designer, so who knows if anybody will ever see it. But yeah, Pole Saw's there, just leering over my shoulder like a creep. Be sure you like and share and subscribe. You can go follow me over on Instagram where I post updates about the channel and memes. It's honestly more memes than anything else. And that's it. Thanks again for the support. And until next time, vanish.